Thank you, Everett. Our bodies are what, 60% water or something like that? So, very fitting lesson. April Fools. A couple of you got that.
I didn't hear what you said.
I had this on the screen. That's our former class. Someone asked if I was going to do something for April Fools. I said, no, I like to celebrate that privately usually, but thank you again for being here tonight. Thank you, Daryl and Monica, for dinner tonight. That was really good. Tacos, like Everett said, are always good. We're going to be in 2 Timothy chapter 1. We'll pick up in verse 3 in just a moment. But before we read this section, I'm hoping to get through verse 7. Let me just recap a little bit about what we've talked about the last couple of lessons, just sort of setting the context, because we're kind of picking up in the middle of a section, so I want to just get some context. So Paul is writing to Timothy. That's, he's the who of 2 Timothy. Paul is writing to Timothy, and he's writing to Timothy from Roman imprisonment. Now, this is not the first time Paul has been in Roman imprisonment. When he writes the books of Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, he's also in Roman imprisonment, but this time it's a little different. That first imprisonment, he was more or less under house arrest. He had some liberties that he could utilize. Then people could come and go and serve Paul and so on and so forth, but this time, as he's writing, he is in what we would typically think of when we think of someone being in prison. He's in what I imagine is like a jail cell. This is a little more harsh, and it's a little more gloomy in terms of the nature and in terms of Paul's outlook. We'll get to the end, and Paul is anticipating his death. And so he's writing to Timothy from Roman imprisonment, and they've been apart for some time. Now, I don't know the last time that Paul and Timothy had seen each other, but it's evident when you read this letter that it had been a while at least, and it's evident that Paul missed Timothy. He says a couple different places, I long to see you, and in fact, we'll see that in the text we're going to look at here in a little while. He wants to see Timothy. When you get to the ending, that is especially evident when he's wanting Timothy to come to him and to come quickly before winter and bring these various things that he left at Troas and so on. And so Paul, you got to keep in mind also the relationship between Paul and Timothy. Paul was sort of a mentor to Timothy. When Paul and Silas first meet Timothy at Lystra, he takes Timothy under his wing, and they're travel partners, and they eventually are these great partners in the gospel together. And we looked a little bit last week in the time before, and how Paul, one of the things he would do is he would send Timothy to certain places. He sent him to Corinth. He left him in Ephesus. And so he sent Timothy and Silas ahead when he was leaving Macedonia, or to Macedonia. I don't remember which one off the top of my head, but they had this really special bond together, and we're going to get a glimpse of that as we look at this part here in chapter 1. And so part of what is going on in this letter, sort of the background of this letter, what this letter is all about. For one, he misses Timothy, he's sending greetings to Timothy, but he also is wanting to encourage Timothy. One of the things you might pick up on as we go through this letter, and that I think will become more evident when we get starting in verse 8, hopefully next week, it seems like Timothy needed some encouragement. It seemed like he needed some exhortation to continue on in service to the Lord by way of ministry or just by way in general. And so we left off last week in the middle of verse 3, so I'm just going to read verses 3 through 7, and this will hopefully be what we get through tonight. So 2 Timothy chapter 1, starting in verse 3, we've already went over some of this, but I'll just read it again. He says, I thank God whom I serve, as did my ancestors, with a clear conscience, as I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. As I remember your tears, I long to see you, that I may be filled with joy. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I'm sure dwells in you as well. For this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. So part of this we went over last week, and as Paul gets into what is now the substance of the letter, we're getting through the introduction part of it. And so as he gets into the substance of the letter, he tells Timothy that he is thankful to God. That's the very first words of the essence of the letter. He says, I thank God whom I serve. Now, before he elaborates on what he's thankful for to God, he mentions that he serves God with a clear conscience. And we spent a little bit of time last week looking at the fact that having a clear conscience is a great and wonderful thing. All of us, I'm sure, have things that we have said and that we have done in the past that we deeply regret and that we are sorrowful. That doesn't mean we can't also have a clear conscience. I'm sure Paul had things that he was deeply sorrow about, and yet he says he serves God with a clear conscience. And that, again, is very meaningful when you understand just who Paul was and what he did in his former life as a Jewish Pharisee. He persecuted Christians. He breathed out threats and murder against the church, as the book of Acts tells us. And this is only possible because of the gospel. It's only through the transformative power of the gospel that you can take someone like Saul of Tarsus and he could become Paul, this great apostle, who we so much so look up to today. And so the rest of verse 3, he says, I thank God whom I serve, as did my ancestors, with a clear conscience, as I remember you constantly. This again, when you think about the relationship between Paul and Timothy, and again, I've said it before and I'll say it once again, this is perhaps the most personal letter that Paul writes. He wrote to large groups of people, such as to congregations or even to whole cities, but he also wrote to some individuals. He has another letter to Timothy, which we just finished studying with Jim's class. He also wrote a letter to Titus, and he wrote a letter to Philemon. And yet 2 Timothy is far more personal, I would say, than all of those. We get a much more look at the intimate relationship between Paul and Timothy, and we get a glimpse of that here. He says, I remember you constantly. He constantly was thinking of Timothy. Even as far apart as they may have been, assuming Timothy is perhaps in Ephesus or somewhere in Asia, and Paul is in Rome, there's some distance between them, but that doesn't mean that Paul is not thinking of Timothy. And in fact, he says he's constantly thinking of him night and day. And so there's not a day that goes by that Paul doesn't think about Timothy. And I hinted at this a little last week, and I want to mention it again. He says, as I remember you. That word remember or remind, it's the same base word in the original language, although they are a little different, but it's the same base word. They mean essentially the same thing. That word is used 3 times in these 3 verses, in verses 3, 4, and 5. And when you think about in the Bible, when something is repeated, it's oftentimes done for emphatic purposes. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily Paul's intention here, but it shows us something, nonetheless, about their relationship. Paul constantly remembered Timothy, and I'm sure Timothy thought of Paul often as well. But notice what else he says. He says, I remember you constantly in my prayers, night and day. I don't know if you do this or not. I hope that you do in some way, shape, or form. Have some sort of prayer list at home, whether it's written down or maybe you have it sort of internalized. Maybe you have people you think of that you pray for. We have a prayer list here at our congregation, and it's quite lengthy when you take into account not only the recent ones, but also those who have ongoing health issues. There's a large number of people there. I imagine Paul's prayer list must have been lengthy. And I say that based on the other times when Paul says he's praying for people. And these are just some of the examples in his letters. He writes to the Romans. He says he's praying for them. To the Ephesians, to the Philippians. He mentions that twice, that he's praying for them in Philippians 1. To the Colossians. In both letters to the Thessalonians, he mentions that they were praying for them. And to Philemon as well in verses 4 through 6. And so that's the majority of Paul's letters that he writes, where he's saying he's praying for those people he's writing to. And I'm sure even when he doesn't mention it, he's also praying for the other people that he wrote to as well. And so I imagine that Paul, he did a lot in his ministry. I'm not sure there's something he did more than praying. He seems to have done a lot of prayer, and in a time when Paul is bound with chains, in a time where Paul doesn't have the freedom to come and go, where people aren't coming and going and serving Paul while he's in prison, in a time where he really has nothing else to do, if nothing else, Paul could pray. And I think that says something for us as well. As we study this book and we think about the key theme of the book is being a worker approved, you could summarize the theme of the book in chapter 2 and verse 15, which we'll get to later on. But when you think about being a worker approved for the kingdom, a worker approved for God, doing the work of the kingdom, that looks differently for each of us. We're called to different ways of serving each other and being a servant, being a worker for God. But if there's nothing else we can do, we can pray. I'm reminded of that movie, The War Room, where this older woman, she sets up a war room, and it's in her closet, and that's where she fights her battles in prayer. And I love that image. If there's nothing else we can do, we can certainly pray. And I think we have a group here that's good at that, and I'm grateful for that. In verse 4, Paul says, as I remember your tears. Here's the other thing, or here is another thing that Paul remembers. He remembers Timothy constantly, and he remembers his tears. Now, as we read the Bible, we tend to want to fill in gaps as to things that we don't know about, and this might be one such occasion. Well, what was the source of Timothy's tears? Well, Paul doesn't say. And so, unfortunately, we really can't know for certain. We can guess. We can try to fill in those gaps, but oftentimes I find that that's more harmful than helpful because imaginations can run wild sometimes. But what people tend to think of when they read this, perhaps this is a tear-filled goodbye that Paul and Timothy had with each other. That's what most people tend to think as they read this saying, as I remember your tears. Well, that must have been the last thing that Paul saw was the tears of Timothy as they were leaving each other. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what a lot of people think. Another common theory is the tears that Timothy may have had going through a difficult time in ministry. And it's not just full-time ministry, but serving God and serving the kingdom at all is very difficult, and it's very challenging. And this can obviously make someone break down in tears as well. And this makes a lot of sense given the context of the letter, that Paul is exhorting Timothy. He's encouraging him to continue on in this service for the kingdom. Some speculate also that this could be a time of grief or loss. We certainly are no strangers to having tears in a moment of grief or loss. But regardless of why the tears are there, Paul remembers them. And again, that says something about Paul, that as he's thinking about Timothy, he remembers not only the good things that they've done together, but he remembers his tears. He has concern for Timothy. He has concern for his partner in the gospel. And these tears, as he continues in verse 4, these tears are among some of Paul's motivation for going and seeing Timothy, for Timothy to come to Paul. And he says that he will be filled with joy on this occasion. So again, in verse 4, he says, as I remember your tears, I long to see you, that I may be filled with joy. Those tears that Paul remembers, those are the part of the motivation for wanting to see Timothy. And notice, he doesn't just say, I want to see you. He says, I long to see you. That wording is emphatic in the original language. The word literally means to have a strong desire for something with implication of need. This is the same word that Peter uses when he talks about longing for the pure spiritual milk. It's the same word. This is what Paul is saying in regard to Timothy. He says he longs to see him. He has a need to see Timothy. So when you think about that, that again shows the bond that these two men, these two workers for God have. And in verse 5 he says, I'm reminded of your sincere faith. I love this. This really gives us insight into their relationship. The word sincere here, the Greek word is anupokritos, and if that sounds familiar, I'll explain why in a second. But that word, and there's not going to be a test, you don't have to memorize that. But the word literally means without play acting. That's the idea behind this word, without play acting. I don't know if you've ever seen actors in real life before, not when they're acting, but just out in the real world. The picture on the screen, it's a picture of the actor Jaleel White, and he's most well known as playing Steve Urkel in the old sitcom Family Matters. I don't know if you've watched that. It's a great sitcom. I imagine when that show was going on, if people were to see Jaleel White out just doing whatever he might be doing, grocery shopping, going to the gym, whatever it might be, I imagine he would have gotten bombarded with people wanting him to say something in the Steve Urkel voice. If you've ever watched the show, you know he has a distinct voice. He has a distinct sort of cadence to how he talks. And he even has distinct lines throughout the show, catchphrases and so on and so forth. I imagine after a while, Jaleel White must have gotten sick of that, saying, I'm here, I'm with my family, I'm trying to run an errand, can't you just leave me alone? We're not in TV land right now. I just want to do what it is I'm here to do. This is the idea behind the word that is used for sincere. It's someone who's not play acting. This is real life here. This is the real world. And the word anupokritos, all it is, it's the word for hypocrite, hypokritos, and you throw a negative prefix in front of it. And we do this in English, like a theist is someone who believes in God, but an atheist is someone who doesn't. You throw that little a at the beginning, that's a prefix, and it negates the meaning of the word. Well, this is the exact same thing here with the word hypocrite. And so this is someone who is not hypocritical. This is someone who is sincere. And so Timothy's faith, it's not an act. This is a true and genuine faith. Timothy is not playing an act here. He's not playing a character. This is the real deal. And I think that's evident by the things that Timothy does. He wouldn't do these things if it was an act. And we see not only the fact that Timothy's faith is genuine or sincere, but we see where it comes from. It comes from his family. In verse 5, he says, I'm reminded, there's that word again, reminded or remember. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. And so this is where Timothy's faith comes from. It comes from his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. And it's interesting to think about, Paul evidently must have known Timothy's family. He would have likely met them when he first met Timothy at Lystra. For Paul to say that he knows that's where his faith comes from, either he knew them or he at least heard of them, perhaps from Timothy. We read in Acts 16 when Paul and Timothy first meet, and it says there in Acts 16 in verse 1, Paul came to Derbe and to Lystra, and a disciple was there named Timothy, the son of the Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. So we see a little bit about Timothy when we first see him in the Bible. We see that, for one, when Paul meets him, he's already a disciple. Paul did not convert Timothy. Timothy was already a disciple. It seems his mother was also a disciple. It says she's a believer. I assume that means she's a Christian. And so Paul did not have a hand in their conversion, but he certainly has a hand in developing Timothy. And we also see that his father was a Greek, or a Gentile, someone who is not of presumably any faith at all. And there's implications of that when you read on in Acts and when you read in Galatians, for example, about circumcision and so on, but that doesn't fit our topic here tonight. But we see that Timothy, his faith comes from his family. It comes from his grandmother Lois, and it comes from his mother Eunice. And they're already believers when Paul meets them. We also read later in chapter 3 and verse 15 of this book, 2 Timothy, that Paul says that Timothy has been acquainted with the Scriptures since his childhood. He says specifically there in chapter 3 and verse 15, actually starting in verse 14, "But as for you, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you've been acquainted with the sacred writings." He's talking about the Scriptures here. He's talking about the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. That's what they had back then. These sacred writings which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. And so we see in Timothy, his faith is one that is a generational faith, one that has been passed down generation to generation to generation. Now, at least a third generation of believers. And so as we study this, what we see here, and I think this has very meaningful application for us, especially our audience, we see the importance of godly parents and also godly grandparents. Oftentimes we think of being a parent and then being a grandparent, and usually the job of the grandparent is to spoil the grandkids to the detriment of the parents, right? That's usually how that goes. I was a spoiled grandkid. I know that to be true, at least for me. But we see that there's more to being a grandparent than just spoiling those kids, as fun as that is, especially to receive that. But we see that there's more to this. It's not just giving them what they want, whatever that might be. It's ultimately passing down the faith through the generations, keeping that sustainable faith in the home. What we see in this, we talk some about evangelism, going into all the world and trying to make disciples, right? That's something that we're called to do. I would argue, and I say this as someone who's not a parent, so take this with a grain of salt, but I think it's true, the single greatest opportunity that we as people have for evangelism lies in the home. We often think, well, how can I go and convert people? How can I go and study with people? Well, if they're in your home, you don't really have to go anywhere. You're already there. They're already there with you. They already look up to you, at least hopefully, if it's your children or your grandchildren. That's the single greatest opportunity for evangelism that we have. There's all these different models for evangelism. If you ask different people, they'll tell you, no, this is the best model for evangelism, whether it's door knocking or giving out free Bibles or giving someone a tract or a pamphlet or something. And there's all sorts of things online. You hear people talking about doing things on Facebook or doing things on TikTok or whatever it might be, and I'm sure those things are effective. But again, I would argue that the single greatest opportunity for evangelism, with perhaps the biggest percentage of yield, would be in the home. We also see in this not just a model of evangelism, but a model of youth ministry. If you've been around for any number of years, you probably have heard people say good things about youth ministry and bad things about youth ministry. Youth ministry is kind of a mixed bag. And I say that as someone who grew up in a youth group. It was good for me, but it's not good for other people. And you think about that, I graduated in a youth group. There was, I think, 6 or 7 of us that were in that graduating class of that youth group. As far as I know, I'm the only faithful member of the church out of that group. So maybe there's merit to what makes a good youth ministry within a congregational model and what doesn't. Typically, you have one youth minister, and you might have volunteers. Hopefully you have volunteers. That's a lot of work for one person. And you do all these things. You have fun with the youth and so on and so forth. But when you think about what is the biblical model of youth ministry, which matters, we want to do things the biblical way. And I'm not frowning upon being part of a youth group or having a youth minister, but the biblical model for youth ministry is, again, the home. It's a godly home. It's a house with godly parents, ideally both parents, and with godly grandparents. I was in a youth group, but perhaps the reason why I'm the only one of my graduating class that is still faithful is because I have faithful parents. And I had 2 sets of faithful grandparents. Perhaps that's why. Perhaps it has nothing to do with the youth group at all. Perhaps it has nothing to do with the youth minister at all. Perhaps it is the fact that you have a home with godly parents and godly grandparents. When I was in school, I took a youth ministry class because I studied Bible and ministry, and so I had a youth ministry class. Most of what I learned in there I don't remember because I don't think it was all that meaningful necessarily, but one thing that I really remember that stands out to me is them saying, okay, youth ministers, it's not your job to develop, spiritually speaking, these kids. You can help, you can be a tool, but that's not the youth minister's job. That's the parent's job. That's the grandparent's job. As preachers or youth ministers or whatever role you want to fill in, we can't do what parents do. You can have the greatest youth minister who's ever lived, but if they're not getting it at home, that's only good for so much. And I've seen it happen because the youth minister I had was at that congregation for almost 30 years, and he's highly regarded. But if you don't have that influence at home, that's only good, again, for so much. I'm reminded of Deuteronomy 6, and there's a reason why God instituted this for the Jewish people. We see the pattern that's laid out for us. First here for the Jews, and I think you see it as in an example with Timothy here. In Deuteronomy 6, this is after the famous passage, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and so on and so forth, the Shema as they called it. And it goes on to say, and these words that I command you today shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children. Again, that's strong language that the Lord uses. Teach them diligently to your children. And shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. This is something that's constant. This isn't something that is done in a lackadaisical manner. This is something that needs to be very intentional. And it goes on to say, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, and so on. And so we see how important this is for parents and grandparents to pass the faith down to their children. We see this with Timothy. And we look around, and so many of us that are here today, not necessarily all of us, but many of us are Christians in some way, shape, or form because of our parents or because of our grandparents. My grandparents were huge influences on me. And so if you are a grandparent and you don't think there's anything you could do, you're wrong. I can confidently tell you that, and I can certainly tell you that if you're a parent. We all have a part in this as fellow church members here, but that is especially true of parents and grandparents. We have a little bit of time. Are there any comments or questions on any of that before we get into verses 6 and 7? Don't do it, CJ. Lance.
Thank you for mentioning the takeaway you had from youth ministry because, I'm not a parent. My experience with the parent-child relationship is rather one-sided. But from what I've gathered, if you don't teach your children, somebody will. And you might not like what they're teaching.
Yeah. Lance makes a great point. He said if you are not teaching your children, someone will. And children are very naive. And children are very susceptible to just follow whatever. Children are generally more followers than they are leaders. Some are natural leaders, but for the most part, they will just follow whatever's in front of them. And so if they're not getting a godly example from you in the home, they'll get some other example from someone else, and you don't know what that something else or someone else might be. And so that's a very dangerous thing. Daryl.
Also, learning about Jesus as a child versus trying to learn as an adult later in life is just, if they're in that environment, it's so much easier for them to learn about the concepts and learn about, read about Jesus versus now someone's post-college or whatever, develop these ideas in their head. Lance was saying other people have been talking in their ear, and it becomes much harder to, them in believability or whatever, that they
Mr. Darrell points out it's easier to teach them when they're younger, when perhaps they haven't been corrupted by other outside influences. And not only that, I think scientifically children are more apt to learn when they're younger. If you're, for example, I've heard this in regards to teaching children languages. Say you're a bilingual person, maybe you have Hispanic parents who speak Spanish and you speak English and the other family speaks English. If you want the child to know both languages, you need to teach them younger because it's easier for them. And I forget the term, it's like neuroplasticity with their brain or something like that, but it's easier for them to retain this information and for it to stick when they're younger. When they get older, then they get other things in there, and it tends to muddy the waters, so to speak. And so that's very important as well, to do it younger.
They're always watching. Children, they're always watching what you're doing. They watch and they see you, they see the way that you handle yourself, the way that you conduct yourself. And I think it's, actions speak louder than words. Kids pick up on those type of things. Whether your faith is genuine, whether you're truly a believer, or you're kind of on the fence, or what, they take all that in. It's all part of that development.
Darrell also points out that children are really attentive. They are always watching. And they pick up on the things that you as parents or you as grandparents do. From a young age, I understood, going to church, being a Christian, that was very important to my grandparents. I learned that very early on. I'd go and spend time with them, and every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night, they were at church. They were always there no matter what. And that really stands out to me. And other things might stand out to kids if perhaps spiritual things are not as important. If maybe you're more caught up in other things. If work is more important, and I'm not saying work can't be important, but it shouldn't be more important than spiritual things, of course. And children will notice that. They'll pick up on that, and that tends to repeat itself over time. And if anything, it tends to even sort of exponentially weaken. I think I already read verses 6 and 7, but I'll read it again. For this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. So now, after speaking of Timothy's sincere and generational faith, now at least 3 generations, he gives Timothy this word of exhortation. And this is going to continue in verse 8 and following, but I want to just spend a little bit of time focusing on verses 6 and 7. And so the groundwork that's been laid here is the fact that Timothy has a sincere faith. That's the background of this. And so, and again, the wordplay here I think is interesting. So 3 times the word remember or reminded is used in verses 3, 4, and 5. And now in verse 6, he says, where's that? For this reason, I remind you. That again is the same word, but it's used in a little bit of a different way. Now it's used as just as a verb, I guess. And so he's saying, now I'm reminding you about this. And what the reminder is this. He says, fan into flame the gift of God which is in you. I really like this imagery. If you're fanning something into flame, the idea behind that is it's making it hotter. And I've not understood this, but I've picked up on it over the years. If you've spent any time camping or any time around campfires or bonfires, you've probably seen someone get down on the ground and try to blow air on the coals or on the kindling to try to get it hotter. Because what happens, and I didn't really know the science of this until fairly recently, you're blowing air on it. What that's doing is it's pushing oxygen and pressurizing oxygen to it, and the oxygen makes it hotter. It ignites it. Fire needs oxygen in order to get hot and in order to burn fairly well. Some people, of course, take it a step farther, and they'll do something like get a leaf blower and blow on it that way. That'll really get it going. I've seen that in person before. And so this is the idea that Paul is saying here about fanning this into flame. It makes it hotter. And so metaphorically speaking, This is the idea that Paul is giving to Timothy, is to take this gift and to make it stronger. And I want to mention that to flame something, or to fan it into flame, that doesn't mean that it's burning out. It doesn't mean necessarily that it's in danger of getting quenched. But rather, you can fan something into flame as a preventative measure to get it hot so that it's not going to give out. And I think that's the idea here behind what Paul is saying to Timothy. It certainly seems as if Timothy faced some challenges and he needed some encouragement, but I don't think he was necessarily on his way out by any means. This seems to be more of a preventative thing, or just a shot in the arm kind of thing for Timothy. And so he says to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you. Again, this is a thing where we want to fill in the gaps. What is this gift that Timothy had? Well, Paul doesn't specify, and so we can't really say, and I don't think it's good to speculate. He only says here that he had this gift in this particular context through the laying on of Paul's hands. Now, if you're familiar with 1 Timothy, if you kept up with our previous study, you may be reminded of 1 Timothy 4 and verse 14, where Paul writes to Timothy before, don't neglect the gift you have, which was given by prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands on you. That, in that context, is referring presumably to Timothy being commissioned for ministry. When the elders come and lay hands on you in the book of Acts, that's generally what that means. You see it in Acts 13 when Paul and Barnabas are sent out to go on the missionary journey. That's presumably what 1 Timothy 4 is talking about, Timothy being commissioned for the work of ministry for the kingdom. But this is not the same thing as what Paul is writing in 2 Timothy 1. And the reason I say that is because this was done by the council of elders. In 2 Timothy 1, Paul says that this was the laying on of his hands. Now, some say perhaps Paul was there with the council of elders, but Paul doesn't say that, so I'm not going to put those words in Paul's mouth. Some speculate then that this is some sort of miraculous gift. When you read through the book of Acts, it is evident that the apostles and the apostles alone could impart these miraculous spiritual gifts to people by the laying on of hands. And Paul, as an apostle, had that ability. And in fact, he did that on a few occasions if you read through the book of Acts. Now again, what the miraculous gift is, if it is a miraculous gift, we don't know, because Paul doesn't say, whether it's the gift of prophecy or the gift of tongues or whatever it is. But regardless of whatever the gift is, perhaps ministry itself is the gift, but regardless, it is imperative for Timothy that he strengthen this gift, that he not, and again, I think of what he said in 1 Timothy, don't let this go to waste. I think of muscles. If you don't use it, you lose it. They atrophy. I think this is perhaps the same sort of thing that Paul is saying to Timothy. Fan this gift into flame. Make this strong so that you never have to worry about it going away. And as readers today, we can't help but think, well, what are our gifts? Each of us are gifted in some way, shape, or form, whatever it might be. I'm gifted in some ways. You're gifted in some ways. We all have various gifts. And so what are our gifts? And then how can we best use these gifts for the kingdom? And how can we use these gifts in the appropriate way for the kingdom? Because sometimes we may be gifted in one thing, but that may not serve the purpose of the kingdom. It may not be what God wants us to do, even if we have a certain gift. And there's various examples I could give, but I don't think that's necessary. And so he says to Timothy, to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. And he gives the reason why. For, in verse 7, God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. Whatever the gift is that Timothy had, again, you could try to fill in the blanks. I don't think that's necessarily helpful. But whatever the gift was, one thing is certain. Fear would serve to quench it rather than strengthen it. Fear quenches it instead of fanning it into flame. This is something that would put the fire out, fear. And when we talk about fear here, this is not the kind of fear that's like a phobia type of fear. There's actually a word in the Greek language that refers to that fear. The word is phobeos. It's where we get the word phobia from. But that's not the word that he uses here. The word is instead refers to a lack of mental or moral strength. And an example would be cowardice, something that is more cowardly. And you could think of stage fright, I think, is a perfect example of that. Someone who gets stage fright. That would be an example of this kind of fear. You get up to give a speech or something and you freeze and you just fold in that moment. This is the kind of fear that Paul is talking about. And this kind of fear, it directly sabotages faith. How many times have you heard the contrast, faith over fear? Well, there's a reason that contrast exists, because these two, in their essence, are opposed to each other. Fear prevents true, genuine faith. I think of this proverb from Proverbs 29 and verse 25, where it says, "The fear of man lays a snare," it lays a trap, "but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe." Another word for trust is faith. And so fear directly sabotages faith. Fear prevents us from doing what it is that we've been called to do, whatever that something might be. In general, living a faithful life, obedient to God and obedient to His Word. Fear prevents us from doing that. And we might have different fears or whatever it might be, but fear prevents us from doing that. And just to further illustrate the kind of fear that we're talking about here, I had a good friend in college who was petrified of asking girls out on dates. He was petrified of it. He wouldn't do it. And we finally, one day, he had this girl that he really liked. He was really into her. And it was getting to the point where it was almost kind of creepy if he didn't do something about it. And so me and another friend, we pulled him aside. And again, I'm not an expert, but, we pulled him aside and we said, "Dude, you got to do something about this. Just sitting on your hands, that's not going to accomplish anything. It will literally do nothing." And so he finally mustered up the courage to ask her out. She said no, unfortunately. But that friend is married now. So evidently he did overcome that fear. But you could think of it in that context. You could think of it in context of, again, stage fright, getting up and giving a speech, giving some sort of presentation. I know a lot of people who have stage fright in that regard. And in fact, Jerry Seinfeld has a really well-known bit about this, talking about how the fear of public speaking is the number one fear in America, and the number two fear is death. And so when you think about it, at a funeral, the average person would rather be in the casket than up giving the eulogy. We have a great fear oftentimes of that. And I have a baseball player here. This is Aaron Judge. He's a phenomenal baseball player, but he tends to freeze in the big moments. He gets up with runners on base in a big game and he strikes out almost every time. And so again, the idea behind this is the sort of fear that prevents us from doing what we need to do, what needs to be done. And I think it's fitting, thinking about this, that if we have that fear, that does not come from God. God has not given us this spirit of fear, but rather He's given us a spirit of power, the ability to do these things, and love and self-control. Love and self-control, of course, being fruit of the Spirit, if you assume that the Spirit he's talking about is the Holy Spirit. And this, of course, will segue us into verse 8 when he gives Timothy the exhortation, "Therefore do not be ashamed." But we'll save that for next week. Any other comments or questions? Thank you, everybody, for your attention. Looking forward to studying with you again. At this time, Jim will share some announcements with us, and then we'll be dismissed.